Welcome to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. I'm your host, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's live Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, including data center operators like hyperscalers, co-location providers, edge data center providers, modular and wholesale data center providers, as well as the dozens of different kinds of data center technology related companies and data center facilities related companies, plus all of the construction, real estate, and investment kinds of companies in and around data centers, as well as the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. And we're thrilled to have you with us, regardless of what your role is on the go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in some kind of facet of sales, like as a sales development or business development rep, an SDR or BDR, or an account executive, or an account manager. Or maybe you're working in some facet of marketing, like digital marketing, content marketing, events marketing, social media marketing, product marketing, or maybe your entire focus is product management or innovation. Or perhaps your company has some kind of direct and indirect playbook and you work on channel partnerships. Or maybe you're the leader, the executive sponsor who's responsible for going out into the marketplace and recruiting the best and brightest to come work as part of your team. And even more importantly, make sure that the right people are sitting in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing their musical instruments at just the right time and the volume and the right tempo to orchestrate and make this amazing period of growth happen on a national, on a regional, on a global basis throughout the entire data center ecosystem. If this is the first time that you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. And let us know in the comments where you're joining us from and what you do in the data center industry. If you've been with us before, if you're a frequent flyer, we're thrilled to have you back as well. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing email newsletter that comes to your email inbox each and every Sunday. You can sign up for free, subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for today? What are we going to be talking about? We're first going to start by looking at one specialized kind of data center operator. We're going to talk about how to generate leads for edge data centers, how to generate edge data center leads. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a co-location cloud and managed service provider, MSP, can improve its lead generation. Following that, we'll take an overview of how to improve lead generation for a data center digital marketing and media company. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about infrastructure, and in particular, how an IT infrastructure provider can improve its lead generation and sales. Then we'll look at how a leading co-location and interconnection provider improves its demand generation. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's show, we'll look at how a data center services and solution company can get in front of opportunities first. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you are facing, that your team is struggling with at your company, and you think it's something that we should add to the agenda for an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we'll add that to the consideration queue of potential topics for upcoming shows. So without any further delay, let's dive right into this week's first question, which takes us right into a really hot area of the data center ecosystem, edge data centers. And the question is, how do we generate edge data center leads? So to put this in context, an edge data center provider is a data center operator It's a company that would engage with data center technology providers. Certainly, there's lots of different kinds of data center technology in its edge data centers. It would also likely engage with facilities related companies because edge data centers are a kind of data center facility. They just tend to be a little bit smaller than colocation facilities. They tend to be a lot smaller than hyperscale facilities. And what's typically valuing those edge facilities most is there's a premium on its precise location. If we go back as recently as 10 years ago, when companies were deciding where colocation facilities were going to be placed, they generally made these decisions on a regional level. Of course, there were real estate considerations, but for the most part, they were looking to have coverage in a given metropolitan area, in a given suburban area. They weren't necessarily looking for, okay, we're in Chicago, we're in London, we're in Singapore, and we want this location to be on this exact street corner at this exact GPS coordinate. No, it was just a matter that they wanted to have coverage in that particular city, in Chicago, in London, in Singapore, wherever it was, because they knew there were a lot of potential IT buyers in that location that wanted a colo facility that was pretty easy to get to, that was within like a 30 or 60-minute drive. Server hugging has been alive and well for decades. It's still alive and well, but now it's more than that. Now we have all these latency sensitive applications, certain kinds of AI applications, certainly smart cities, IoT, autonomous driving. They're all a lot of financial trading applications are all very latency sensitive, distance sensitive. So that precise location definitely carries a premium. We're also seeing now edge providers using edge to get data center facilities out in underserved areas. Like there's typically tier 1 locations, like in the US, people are pretty familiar with the idea that Dallas, Chicago, Northern Virginia, Northern California, Southern California, Dallas, those 5 or 6 big markets all have historically carried a premium and a certain amount of prestige as tier 1 markets. In recent years, strong tier 2 markets have been emerging right now, like Atlanta, Portland, Oregon, Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona for a long time, Salt Lake City. There's a lot of widely recognized tier 2 markets. I'm based in South Florida. Miami has long been considered a tier 2 market that's incredibly important as a gateway to Latin America. But now there's this emergence of like tier 3 and tier 4 markets that have been completely under the radar screen in underserved regions. So edge certainly can provide some applications around that. So, the interesting part with the edge data center business model is in a lot of ways doing lead generation for edge has a lot of the same parallels that you would use for running a lead generation program for a colocation data center operator, meaning that we need to be very aware and very specific about the kinds of accounts that we're most likely to win and retain. The smaller your company is and the more scarce your resources are, the more incredibly important it is to be a lot more precise in how you define your ideal client profile and your prioritized buyer personas. For most data center operators, especially like an edge data center provider, usually this self-awareness starts by looking at where you've been most successful in the past. When it comes to data center operators, usually we don't need to look much further than your website homepage, and we can usually see logos of some of your favorite clients that you love to brag about. If there's a case study section, we can certainly see companies described within there. There could be a testimonials or review section. There's public facing clues about who some of your ideal clients are. And if we can't find that there, we want to supplement that. Certainly when you go look in your CRM, your customer relationship management system, when you talk to your chief revenue officer or equivalent, your chief commercial officer, certainly your CEO and your CFO, your financial head of finance, they'll have a real strong pulse on which clients are actually paying the bills and which are strategically most important and which they'd love to clone and get a lot more of. So that will help you back into your ideal client profile, which is a really important prerequisite for planning your lead generation strategy. So on your simple one-page ideal client profile, we need to know geographically where these clients are located. When it comes to edge, that should be a pretty straightforward question, right? In a perfect world, if you have a half a dozen edge facilities that are located throughout a particular nation or particular region, you're generally looking for clients potential clients that are located within a 30 or 60-minute drive of those 6 locations. Now, that's like the 80%. The 20%, there will also be a considerable amount of potential clients that are located way outside of those geographic regions that can't easily drive to your edge facility. They can't easily visit your facility. And they're specifically looking for that edge location for a bunch of reasons. They could be looking to it because there is a strategically important client that needs incredibly fast performance out of the assets that are sitting in that particular data center. There could also, so there's a client reason, there's a technology platform reason. Many times there's also a governance reason. Let's say, for example, your company is headquartered in Europe and you need a couple of points of presence. You need a couple of edge locations that are in strategically important markets in the US, or you're located in Asia Pacific, and the same thing. You decide that you need an edge location, a very precise location in downtown San Francisco, in the center of Chicago, in the center of New York, what have you. So you're looking for very, very specific locations, and it's a long distance search as opposed to a local search. And those have very different implications for lead generation. But either way, that certainly needs to factor into how you define the geographic part of your ideal client profile. Another important part of your ideal client profile, again, these are basic foundational issues for planning your lead generation strategy, is knowing the company size. Now, everyone, and I mean literally everyone in co-location sales, is wired to, when we talk about size, to immediately think about kilowatts and megawatts. And maybe they're thinking about square footage and square meters. But the reality is, when it comes to prospecting and lead generation, we generally need to normalize around your prospect's company size. And most of the prospecting databases that are super popular, things as basic as like LinkedIn Sales Navigator and Apollo and ZoomInfo, they run on company headcount, the number of employees a particular company has. And we generally need to normalize a bottom range and a top end of the range for where you can win and land and expand and retain best over a period of time. And again, only you can answer this question by looking at your actual data. But let's say, for example, you know that your minimum commitment level in one of your edge data centers is a full cabinet. And you know the price point for that full cabinet. And you know, based on that, that it's very likely that the minimum company size that a company needs to be able to afford to take that full cabinet in your edge data centers is, for argument's sake, 50 employees, or maybe it's 200 employees. Either way, once you know that information and how it matches up with what your entry level commitment looks like, that becomes the floor, the minimum level of employees that a company needs to have to make it into your ideal client profile, to make it into your target account list. Conversely, at the upper end of the range, where do you find that a certain company can be so large that its IT requirements, its legal requirements, compliance, integration, financial requirements are just not something that your company can currently handle today? And the reality is they need a much larger edge provider than your company is. Now, if you work for a huge data center operator and you have those resources and you feel super confident going after Fortune 50 companies and Fortune 500 companies, knock yourself out. But for a lot of small to mid-size edge data center providers, there's a finite ceiling at which point it may just not be practical to have an enterprise client that's that large, that's 20%, 30%, 40% of your annual revenue, that's making all of these demands that your company just isn't ready for today. So let's say, for argument's sake, you say the bottom end of the range is the company needs to have at least 50 employees and have no more than 1,000 employees. That gives you a pretty decent size range. So the next thing is knowing what industry. So we talked about geography, we talked about company size. The next thing is knowing what kind of industries fit especially well into your edge data center offering. Now, this is especially relevant for edge because when it comes to companies putting their IT infrastructure in one of your edge facilities, depending on where you're located and depending on their industry, there may be compliance, accreditation, certification requirements that your company needs to have in order for that kind of company to put its IT infrastructure in your facility. And if you have those accreditations, if you have met those compliance requirements, fantastic. That's an inclusion in your ideal client profile. If you know, for example, that a company that comes along that's government or education or healthcare or financial services is going to ask for accreditation that your company simply does not yet have, that should be an exclusion, because we want to make sure that we work really smart with your lead generation strategy to make sure that we're not wasting resources generating leads that you're not going to be able to close and retain. So we need our inclusions and our exclusions about industry, sometimes known as vertical, sometimes known as niche, about what's an especially good fit to sit in your ideal client profile. From there, we can build out a target account list of a representative finite list of typically anywhere from a couple dozen to a few hundred. In some cases, it may be a few thousand potential accounts, potential companies. That would be a fantastic fit to have their resources sitting in one of your edge data center facilities. And we use the ideal client profile as the guardrails for there. So now we've figured out how to get really specific at the account level or the company level. But when it comes to lead generation, it's not just about the account, it's about the people in the account, the people that are most likely to be on these decision-making committees. And decision-making committee is a really important distinction from how people usually ask me about it. Most of the time when people ask me about lead generation, they want to get to the decision maker as if there's one magical person. And in many companies, most companies, there usually is a person who is the final sign-off. But just understand that in most scenarios today, in the modern self-driven buyer's journey, where people are incredibly allergic to spending time with marketers and salespeople now, it is far more likely that even if you get a personal warm introduction and an initial meeting with the decision maker, that decision maker 9 times out of 10 is going to send you back to meet with their team. Because the last thing in the world someone wants to do is sign up for your edge facility if their team that reports to them is not on board with you as the provider. So we need to be cognizant. We need to be self-aware to understand that there's really no such thing as a decision maker anymore. There's a decision-making committee, which means there's many different stakeholders that need to have awareness that your company exists, that need to trust your company, where we need to educate and build trust with these multiple stakeholders that ultimately weigh in to varying degrees about where a company is going to decide to place its IT infrastructure. So with that in mind, we look at these multiple stakeholders as personas. And the most important bucket, the most important category of stakeholder, we call your primary buyer persona. A buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal stakeholder based on actual research and some educated speculation. The most important economic stakeholder on that decision-making committee we call your primary buyer persona. The second most important stakeholder on that committee, we're going to call your secondary buyer persona. And in enterprise accounts, it's very common to have a tertiary buyer persona and considerably more than 3 categories of stakeholders that you need to worry about. But it's really important to rank those, because with limited resources, we certainly want to start with the most important stakeholders. And once we've identified those folks for our particular ideal client profile, our addressable market, our target account list, once we've identified the first and most important, then we need to do some research, because it's only when we do that research that our lead generation strategy is actually going to resonate with those folks. What do we need to know? Well, we need to know for our primary buyer persona and our secondary buyer persona, what is going on in their world. Not what you would like to be going on in their world, but what is actually going on in their world right now. If you've ever heard of the term being client-centric, this is pretty much one and the same. So for example, with the primary buyer persona, we need to know what the 5 or 6 biggest goals are that they're working on right now that are directly and indirectly related to digital infrastructure, that are directly or indirectly related to, or are a leading indicator that they're going to, at some point in the coming weeks or months, be in market for edge data center facilities. What are their 5 or 6 biggest goals? These usually show up in OKRs, objectives and key results. They certainly show up in job descriptions. And a lot of times they're even showing up on LinkedIn profiles when people describe what they do for a particular company. So those are their 5 or 6 biggest goals. In a perfect world, we'd love to have them ranked in terms of how frequently they come up in the course of doing this research with various people that sit within that buyer persona. Then the flip side with the goals is we need to know what's driving them nuts, what their biggest challenges are, what are their stressors, what are the things that are screwing with their work-life balance that have ruined one or more vacation days where they've tried to unplug, that are causing them to lose sleep, be literally up at 2 o'clock in the morning, either taking care of or worrying about having to take care of. What are these 5 or 6 biggest stressors? Again, in their own words, not what we'd like those words to be, what the words actually are. So face-to-face conversations, Zoom interviews, surveys, studying CRM history are all incredibly impactful for figuring out their own words on their biggest goals and challenges. If nothing else, at the absolute minimum, study a stack of their LinkedIn profiles. Study what shows up when you do a search on that person's name and their company and their job role. Aggregate that all together and figure out what those 5 or 6 biggest goals and those 5 or 6 biggest challenges are, stack ranked in their own words, and then repeat the exact same process for that secondary buyer persona. And it's only when you've gone through this exercise, it's only when you've gone through this research that you're in a position to come up with a lead generation strategy that's got a chance to resonate. If you skip this, your lead generation process is not going to just be about guesses. It's more than likely going to be about egos internally and political maneuvering internally to try to jostle and figure out who has more power within your own company. And you more than likely are going to defer based on age and seniority and who won President's Club and who's got the corner office. And none of those really match up to what's going on inside of the head upstairs when it comes to your most important and second most important categories of buyer personas. So right now, if you have a website that doesn't really resonate, you probably skip buyer personas. If right now your outbound email is not getting it done, you probably have skipped over buyer personas. If right now your social media posts or your digital ads are falling flat, you've probably skipped over buyer personas. And if right now you're sinking an enormous amount of resources into attending, exhibiting at, participating at national and global conferences, and that strategy does not take into account your primary and buyer personas, you are shredding enormous amounts of resources with really no directional strategy in mind. So we need to get that insight in their own words on what's going on, what's most important to them, and how we can potentially help them. That's the basis for your lead generation strategy for being an edge data center provider. Then from a tactical basis, we need to put ourselves in a position where we can really educate and build trust with multiple members of that decision committee from those target accounts. And the most effective way to do that is event marketing. And by event marketing, I'm not talking about buying a big, huge booth on an expo floor of a major national conference. When I'm talking about edge marketing, I'm talking about throwing out the idea that vanity metrics matter, because the reality is many times you're going to a conference with 3,000 attendees. And if you simply looked at the demographics of last year and projected for this year in the media kit and matched it up into your ideal client profile, you might be sick to your stomach at the loss factor that you're experiencing with the needle in a haystack of their audience not really matching up with your target audience. The cool part with doing your own events, and again, you don't need an expo to do your own events. Like if your edge data center facility has a conference room that comfortably seats 10 or 15 people, you have exactly what you need to get started in the educational events business. If you have a Zoom account or you've ever done webinars, you have exactly what you need to get started in the educate and build trust department. Because once we know their 5 or 6 biggest goals and their 5 or 6 biggest challenges, we take those 10 or 12 topics and we put those on our events calendar for the next 10 or 12 months. So for our primary buyer persona, if we want to educate and build trust with multiple people from multiple strategically important companies on our target account list once a month, the first Wednesday morning of the month, for the first Wednesday midday of the month, we hold a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn, and we invite people from those top 100 companies or those top 50 companies in that particular geographic region. And we invite 5, 10, 20 people from each of those companies that are in some way, shape, or form involved with digital infrastructure. So we end up with a potential guest list of probably 500, 600, 800 people. And we invite them to register and join us for a breakfast seminar or a lunch and learn, where that particular month we're tackling one of those 10 or 12 biggest goals and challenges that they and their peers have told us that they're trying to achieve or struggling to overcome. And systematically, we tackle those one at a time. This is not an expensive proposition. If you already have an email marketing program in place, if you already have a CRM in place, if you already know who the companies are and the people within the companies, all we're really looking to do is 4, 6, 8 weeks before the event is do a little bit of outreach with some email, with some phone calls, with some LinkedIn messages, perhaps using some LinkedIn events to your target accounts to invite them to a workshop. It could be with your CTO, it could be with your cybersecurity expert, it could be with your infrastructure expert, it could be with your NOC manager. If you get to a particular topic and you do not have an internal expert who can put together a 30 or 45-minute talk on that particular topic, then go to your contractors, go to your channel partners, and invite a guest expert to come in and be the guest speaker. The fantastic part with all of this is it costs very little to do. You already have access to the conference room, right? You already have access to the webinar account. Yes, as the point person on this initiative, you're going to need to sit down with your subject matter expert and plan this out 8 weeks ahead of time and brainstorm what they would talk about in a talk like this if they don't already have a presentation ready to go. There's a chance they may already actually have something that could be repurposed into a half-hour, 45-minute talk on this topic. If not, you interview them and brainstorm them and help them work on the outline for this. You help them build the slides. You meet with them a couple of weeks before to review the slides and make sure you're good to go on the content. The idea with this is for those 10, 15, 20, or 30 people that are in the room is you want them to have learned so much that's so valuable to what they're working on for their job, for that big stress that they're trying to overcome, that their jaw is dropping with how much they learned that they can take away now to help them better do their job, to help their team better function, because you are introducing them to best practices for how others in a very similar job role, in a very similar geographic region, in a very similar company size, in a very similar industry, have tackled these top of mind issues that keep coming up over and over and over again when you look at people that are in this cohort, when you look at people that are in this buyer persona segment. So real straightforward. If it's a breakfast seminar, you run it from like 8:30 to 10 o'clock in the morning, from 8:30 to 10 when they arrive. There's some networking and some light continental breakfast. Again, that continental breakfast, they're putting out some food for lunch and learn. That's pretty much the extent of your budget. So compared to schlepping your entire team and buying a massive booth on an exhibit hall floor where 80% of the attendees aren't even your ICP, aren't even your ideal client profile, this costs nothing. And because it costs next to nothing, you can run it every single month. And that's exactly what you will want to do once you start to see the dramatic impact that this has on pipeline generation. So 8:30 to 9 o'clock, a little bit of chatting, schmoozing, having some breakfast. From 9 to 9:40 is your formal program. It's where you pull up the slides, you give out the handout, the workbook, whatever you're doing, and you teach as if your company's survival depends on it. Educate and build trust. This should be so good, so incredibly valuable that you're highly confident that if the same session had appeared at a national conference, that particular session would be one of the highest rated sessions out of 100 sessions at that big national conference, that your speaker would get a perfect score of 5 out of 5. And there would be a long line of people waiting to chat with him or her after their session is over. After the formal part of the session, which obviously you can make totally interactive, and you should make it totally interactive. It's a small group. You can certainly invite people to ask more questions. And for anyone that wants to stick around after that, you take them on a tour around your facility. Lather, rinse, repeat. The goal is for the people attending to understand that you have some of the smartest, kindest, most helpful, empathetic people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with edge data centers. And what you'll note is as they see hyperrelevance in the topic, when you say, gee, when it comes to this topic, it typically takes a village. There's usually a team involved. So generally there's people that care about this from operations, from support, from IT, from engineering, from compliance, from finance. So with that in mind, who else would benefit from attending our upcoming event? Hit the forward button on your email and let your colleagues know why this matters. And that alone, that simple email marketing automation that you've been able to do for 20 years, that alone will get your registration list to the point where you're like, hey, cool, there's 4 people from this one company and 5 people from this one company and 2 people from this other company. There's clusters of people registered to come together. Now, it's a free event, so you're not going to get 100% attendance rate in most cases. So you look at who actually attends. And the great part is when you have multiple people from the same company attending, you are proactively driving alignment. The single most important function in a self-driven buyer's journey, where sales and marketing folks are locked out for nearly the entire journey, is your account executive essentially becomes like a project manager to help the internal champion drive alignment. To the extent that you can proactively do this in the early and the middle stages of the buyer's journey, when you're educating and building trust, when you're inserting yourself as part of their learning and development and professional development, magical things will happen with educating, building trust, and sales opportunity generation. So we talked about doing this for your primary buyer persona on the first week of the month. The third week of the month, 2 weeks later, do the exact same thing for your secondary buyer persona. Maybe you want to switch it up, and sometimes it's a breakfast event, sometimes it's lunch and learn, sometimes it's an event after hours in the evening. And for people that can't attend in person, and granted, the cool part is when you have multiple stakeholders from the same company, when they register the second time around, they're a lot more likely to bring even more people from that company. So you're meeting more people from the decision committee. At some point, they may even bring their boss with them. Now, what about the people who can't attend live? Well, certainly record it. You're going to get people that are attending that want to share the recording with their colleagues, share the slides with their colleagues. And for the people that can't attend at all, run the exact same event as a webinar for all of the long distance edge data center prospects. And again, the same thing for a free webinar. Extremely rare to get 100% attendance rate. It's even relatively unusual to get a 50% attendance rate. So record it, make it available for them, and encourage them to share it with their colleagues as a way to proactively drive alignment. The idea with all of this is we need to get out of the vendor box, and we need to stay out of the vendor box. And the most impactful way to do this is to stop showing up as an account executive, stop showing up as a marketer, stop showing up as an account manager, and instead look a lot more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, perhaps even a thought leader. And when we do this, this is our lead generation strategy. If you did nothing else than execute this once a month, every month for the next 12 months for your 2 or 3 most important buyer personas, magical things will happen with lead generation, sales cycle acceleration, and getting opportunities over the finish line. So you have educated clients that believe that you have some of the smartest people on the planet that become a delight to work with. That's what I'd be thinking about for how to generate edge data center leads. If you're getting good value from this week's data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the word by hitting the like button. What do we have up next? What's our next question for this week? So we have another question about a broader segment of data center operators. This time we're talking about colocation, cloud, and managed services. So how does a colocation, cloud, and managed service provider improve its lead generation? So it's already doing lead generation, but its lead generation is not very good. And we have these 3 diverse lines of business that can be somewhat complementary, or in many cases, if it's done well, very complementary. So how does a colocation provider, cloud provider, and managed service provider, one company providing all 3 of these services, improve its lead generation? So the first thing we need to figure out is when it comes to having 3 separate lines of business, are all of your clients a good fit for all 3 of those? Or do you have certain clients that only buy one of those 3 services from your company? This is incredibly important, because if you have clients and prospects that are cherry picking you, that are only buying one of these 3 categories. And usually that comes about because of mergers and acquisition and being in the process of integrating or not tightly integrating all of this, it becomes way more complicated and way more expensive to do this. But if you have a holistic approach to looking at your clients where you're serving less like real estate and more like IT services and more like that trusted technology advisory firm, where you're helping them choose the right mix of colocation and the right kind of cloud, whether it's public cloud, whether it's private cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid, and choosing the right mix of what managed services they should be outsourcing versus what they should be doing in-house. When you have that trusted relationship, that holistic relationship, it becomes a lot more straightforward to figure out how to improve your lead generation. But yeah, figuring out what the blended mix of who that client looks like is incredibly important. And the way we're typically going to do that is we're going to look at who our best clients right now are, who are generating the most revenue, who are the most profitable. I wouldn't necessarily go based on top line or who has the most space in your facility. I would actually go based on, at the minimum, gross profits. So the story that's told on your website for your case studies and your logos and your testimonials may not reflect the reality of what your CEO and your board and your CFO actually wants. So make sure that you float this up the chain and that you understand who are the clients that you actually want more of before you start tinkering with your lead generation strategy. So once you have that in mind, that should help you figure out your ideal client profile. That should help you build your target account list. That should help you figure out your buyer personas, who to prioritize the individual people are. And this kind of business model, that hybrid of colocation, cloud, and managed services, it's very common that one of your core buyer personas, like your secondary or tertiary buyer persona, often is a managed service provider. And that's actually where it starts to get a little bit complicated, where your business is an MSP. You provide managed services, but you also have channel partner relationships with other managed service providers and similar kinds of channel partners that have slightly different ways of explaining what their business model is, like integrators, value-added resellers, VARs, technology consultancies, master agents. What's super important for a company that provides colo and cloud and also provides managed services to people that have infrastructure in their facilities is to get really clear on that, where that line of demarcation is. Because channel partners, just like any other prospects, just like any other clients, need to trust your firm. And MSPs is a bunch. I spent a lot of time in that ecosystem in the early and middle parts of my career. MSPs are a tough bunch to get to trust you. In some cases, in some of those ecosystems, some people may even consider certain kinds of MSPs a little bit paranoid when it comes to trust. So we want to proactively head that off, and we want to be super clear about what kind of managed services that your channel partners tend to provide and what kind of managed services that you provide internally. What I've seen for a lot of small to mid-sized companies with this exact business model, how they typically approach this is, because you own the co-location facility and you're providing cloud services and you're providing managed services to those clients that have servers, that have infrastructure in your facility, usually the demarcation line is that you are only providing managed services when assets are in your facilities. When it comes to those clients having field offices, headquarters, remote offices, all the managed services that need to be provided outside of the data center, that is usually left up to channel partners. So again, you need to figure out what works best for your business model, but that's what I've seen work especially well for small to mid-size co-location companies that are very IT services focused as opposed to real estate focused, that provide a significant amount of managed services as a part of their core offering or as add-ons, either as product services or even as bespoke services, as custom programs. So you need to figure that out because the channel partners are almost certainly going to be a core part of your addressable market, but we need a lead generation strategy that's different for managed service providers. And one of the most important things is to understand each segment, each persona's biggest goals and biggest challenges. The goals of a CTO of a mid-market company in your region, whether it's all different verticals or like a horizontal or specific verticals, that mid-market CTO is going to have very different goals and challenges than a enterprise cybersecurity person. And that enterprise cybersecurity person is going to have very different goals and challenges than the owner of a small managed service provider channel partner with a couple dozen employees. So we need to be super deliberate about understanding their goals and challenges and build our whole lead generation strategy around it. So one of the most important ways to improve lead generation is to get a lot more client centric, to get a lot more dialed into what they're trying to achieve, what their biggest goals are, and what they're struggling with most, what their biggest challenges are, and segment that out. And again, recognize that the CTO of the mid-sized company, very different than the cybersecurity, the CISO of the enterprise company, very different than the owner of the small managed service provider or value-added reseller or technology consultancy. If we try to use a one-size-fits-most, it's going to fall flat. It's not going to resonate in a world where there's just intense competition for people's attention, 724, 365 on a global basis, where you are literally competing against the Gen AI apps. A lot of people don't think about this, but marketers and sales folks and go-to-market professionals in this time and place that we're at right now, like Gartner already found 2 years ago that 83% of buyers, that buyers want to get to the 83% point of their journey before they're open to talking with you. So best case scenario, you're only in there for the last 17% of their research and decision-making process. But just understand, throughout the entire time this is going on, your competition isn't just sales and marketing people from other co-location companies similar to yours, bigger or smaller, and a different geographic region. It's not just humans. You're competing for attention against immediate gratification that they can get from watching YouTube videos, from watching webinars on demand, from going to review websites. And now for the last couple of years, immediate gratification galore from the generative AI tools, from taking what they used to ask you in a face-to-face or Zoom conversation and asking the exact same thing to ChatGPT, to Copilot, to Gemini, to Perplexity, to Claude. That's your competition. Like, whoa, that's pretty intense, right? So we need to get super crisp about who they are and what they care about so we can add value more as a consultant, a teacher, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, maybe even a thought leader. Because if we're just giving generic information that they can get from visiting our website, from watching our explainer video, from watching videos on our YouTube channel, we're going to lose just about every single time, because as good as we are at memorizing that, we're just not going to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for that instant gratification. I call that, if you ever saw the famous movie, there was actually a sequel to it a couple decades later as well, Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory. There was a girl in the movie, Veruca Salt, who in both movies kind of has these spoiled brat tendencies of wanting everything from her father and getting everything from her father now. And the song that she sings in the first movie, and I think there was a version of this in the second movie as well, is "Don't Care How, I Want It Now." And I think in the movie she was supposed to be like 10 or 12 years old, but she's acting more like a toddler, having like toddler kind of temper tantrums. That's a lot of what your core buyer persona has moved to, is they don't care how, they just want it now. And because of that, you are literally in competition with the Gen A apps, the generative AI apps that your co-location data center is enabling. So if you think about that and let that sink in, we need to level up on our lead generation strategy if we're going to be relevant. So to improve that, we need to be super helpful, more like a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor. We need to be very precise on who they are and what they care about. We need to be very personalized on our approach, so we're not wasting their time with generic lead generation, lead magnets, premium content offers. It needs to be super specific to who they are and what they care about. And we need to do a much better job of meeting them where they are in a way that educates and builds trust. I call this intentional lead generation. Most co-location companies that are very new to this think they're generating leads by having a couple forms on their website for someone to schedule a tour or book a consultation or contact sales. The reality is those really weren't competitive 10 years ago. They're not even remotely competitive today. And they're tone deaf to basically the 90 to 95% of the people who could be a really good fit, but there's no way they're ready to talk to someone from your sales team right now. They're just doing research. And if you refuse to provide them the information that they want, if you don't have good lead generation offers for the early and the middle stages of the journey, you're not going to make the short list. They're probably going to disqualify you. So this is an important part of figuring this out. Figuring out the lead generation strategy is understanding the self-journey. The self-driven buyer's journey is a really, really big deal. So we want to reach them early and often. The right people, the right places, the right time, and in the right context. So they see your client-facing team members on your sales and marketing team, on your services team, as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to their knowledge of who they are, what they care about, the kind of company they work for, where they're located, the industry that they operated in, at the intersection of anything and everything having to do with co-location, cloud, and managed services, which means that going forward, they want to basically spend time with peers. So to the extent that you look like someone that could be a peer of theirs, either because you worked in a company like theirs in a previous role, or you've invested in the kind of training and certifications that allow you to pass that test, that's a good thing. To the extent that you don't pass that test, they're probably not going to want to spend a lot of time with you. That doesn't mean that you need to be as technical as they are, but you should at least look like someone that's a junior, advanced beginner, intermediate level colleague that they'd work with on their team or in their organization. When you can pass that test, wonderful things happen. And going forward in the future, this is barely a nice to have now. It's just about a must have. And we see a lot of co-location operators have dramatically changed the kind of people they've hired the last couple of years to insist on this level of technical understanding, to the point where a lot of account executives nights and weekends are spending their time having like a home data center, home computer lab to learn and upskill on these kinds of things. And another big trend that we see going forward that definitely impacts your lead generation strategy is we see a lot of the mid-size and larger co-location operators segmenting their teams by vertical. In other words, they're hiring specialists that are experts on health tech and fintech and telecommunications and government. And the reason they're doing that is, again, the exact same reason, is they figured out that their prospects and clients don't want generic anymore when it comes to AEs, SDRs, BDRs, account managers. They want people that really understand their industry, that really understand their business model. And that's who's winning the attention. So if you're really looking to improve your lead generation, having better educational events, better lunch and learns, better breakfast seminars, better webinars that are for the early and middle and the later parts of the journey, not just the later parts of the journey, but the full journey, is super important. Understanding who they are and what they care about and reflecting that in the topics that you cover in these events are super important. Having great email marketing, so you cover as many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision as possible. Those are all just minimum prices of entry. However, the most important thing to recognize is that most people in this business model right now are wasting enormous amounts of resources by misallocating everything that they're doing with lead generation, or nearly everything that they're doing with paid programs and paid conferences. And the reality is, unless those paid conferences have a very high match rate with your ideal client profile, the loss factor, the waste, is just off the charts. It's so much more precise for you to build back from the bottom and just say, okay, this is my ideal client profile. These are the couple hundred accounts that matter. And we need to get as much time in front of those couple hundred accounts that matter by educating and building trust, not by inviting them to play in our invitational golf tournament, not by inviting them to our martini party, not by begging them to stop by our booth for 90 seconds when they can barely hear themselves think. No, what we want is one or more stakeholders from that company to come and participate in your learning and development and professional development experience that helps them do their job better, that helps their team succeed. How do you know what to talk about? Again, buyer personas, understanding their top 5 or 6 goals, understanding their top 5 or 6 challenges, and segmenting your lead generation strategy based on who they are and where they are in their journey. So those are some of the key things that I'd be thinking about when it comes to being a co-location cloud and managed service provider, MSP, that wants to improve its lead generation. Be incredibly aware of how little time they want to spend with your sales team anymore, how much of a big deal that self-directed buyer's journey is, and be ready to radically change your company culture so that your client-facing team members are no longer seen by their traditional job titles, but are seen a lot more as consultants, subject matter experts, teachers, trusted advisors, and the most senior people on your team as thought leaders. That's the big unlock for how a colo, cloud, and managed service provider can improve its lead generation. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. Okay, what's up next? This is a great question. Actually, we don't often get a lot of questions from the outsourced sales and marketing segment of the data center ecosystem, but in this particular case, we actually got a really good one. How does a data center digital marketing and media company generate more leads? How does a data center digital marketing and media company generate more leads? So it's really interesting to find a company in the outsourced sales and marketing segment of the data center industry coming to DCSMI for advice on this, because presumably if you're a cardiologist, you know the right things to do so you don't put yourself in a high risk category for having a heart attack. If you are a dentist, you generally tell your kids and your family members the right things to eat so they don't cause, so they're not doing silly things that accelerate tooth decay. So the question is, why does a digital marketing and media company need advice on lead generation? Well, just to put this in context, there's 7 or 8 different kinds of business models at DCSMI that we track in the outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem. Some are pretty intuitive, some are not as intuitive. Marketing agencies, PR agencies, super intuitive. Sales consultancies, sales brokers, reasonably intuitive. Manufacturers, reps, and distributors and resellers, a lot less intuitive, but definitely part of the outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem. Recruitment firms, we consider recruiters, data center specific recruiters, part of data center sales and marketing, because their job is to generate leads and accelerate leads into opportunities, both on the hiring manager side and on the candidate side. To a certain degree, training companies are also many times performing a outsourced sales and marketing company, outsourced sales and marketing company, as are events-based companies. So what should a data center marketing and media company be doing to generate more leads? I think a lot of the best practices are sometimes overlooked, because when your expertise around media buying and marketing is focused just on what you're doing for your clients, it's sometimes harder to see the forest through the trees. But at a basic level, it's super important to understand where you're specializing. By the fact that you're calling your company a data center digital marketing company, a data center media company, that is a really great first start, because you're narrowing down. You're not just helping technology companies or enterprise technology companies, you're helping data center specific companies. And that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean you're working with data center operators. It can mean you're working with data center technology companies. You could be working with a lot of different data center facilities companies. If you really have the stomach for it, you could be working with a lot of general contractors and real estate and investment folks. Those are special challenges, because a lot of times investors want to pay everyone in shares and real estate companies want to pay everyone in commission, in the same way that data center recruiters often want to have everyone only paid on when a successful placement is made. So there's inherent biases that come up with the conventional compensation models that come up in some of these, that make them a little more challenging to be able to come up with something that works across the board. But let's say, for example, you're working on a good portfolio, a good cross-section of the data center ecosystem on digital marketing and media. So what you're essentially looking to do is to figure out the kinds of companies that have done best by working with your company on an outsourced basis on their digital marketing and media. And usually when it comes to outsourcing digital marketing and outsourcing, especially paid media, those companies need to be a certain size to even afford your entry-level minimum program. That usually tends to be a really, really big deal. The prevailing wisdom for where we are in the world and costs of doing business and the degree of global competition and everything is there's a lot of marketing media companies who really will set the bar when it comes to big annual programs at $1 million annual revenue, 5 million annual revenue, 10 million in annual revenue, or turnover, or whatever your local currency equivalent is there. And you'll typically normalize that based on number of employees to help with your prospecting and qualification and your lead generation efforts. Now, media companies are a little different, because instead of selling like a big annual retainer or a big project-based program, a media company could potentially be selling a productized service that's a lot more affordable to much smaller companies. Let's say, for example, you're holding regional conferences that are attracting like 500 people at these conferences. And maybe someone can get a booth at that 500 person conference, just basically a tabletop booth, like a 6-foot table where they bring in a vertical banner stand. And maybe it's only a few $1,000s to have a sponsor exhibitor spot in there, in which case at that price point, it certainly opens it up to a much smaller kind of company to be able to participate in your entry-level sponsorship offering if you're an event company. Now, media, there's a couple of different ways to look at media. Usually when people are talking about media, they're usually talking about paid media, meaning that you're responsible for managing their search engine marketing, like their Google ads, managing potentially their paid social, which for data centers for sure would mean LinkedIn ads. Possibly you're also doing their Meta ads, their Facebook and Instagram. ads. That would usually be media. And when it comes to agencies that specialize in media, it takes a fair amount of foundational work, onboarding and strategy work to get enough creative, to get the strategy right, and two, to get enough creative that you're ready to start doing a significant media buy. And if you're not going to do a significant media buy, you're typically not going to get enough data to be statistically relevant to figure out which variations are even working. So it's usually very, very common for companies to say 3-month minimum, 6-month minimum post onboarding, and X amount of thousands or tens of thousands or whatever it is in monthly or quarterly or annual ad budget to be able to participate. All of those really need to be answered first. All of those structural guardrails on product market fit for you, on like who are the ideal clients, what are the products and services that they purchase from your company, at what price points, and how frequently they purchase. If you have not achieved product market fit, if you don't have go-to-market fits, it's very, very difficult for you to generate more of the right leads, because you don't really know who those leads are supposed to be. You haven't really figured out the companies, the individuals. You haven't figured out any of the unit economics. So when it comes to a digital marketing and media company, as long as you already have achieved product market fit, and as long as you've already achieved go-to-market fit. Now, again, product market fit is knowing exactly the products and services, who buys them, at what price point, how often, basically all the core unit economics. Go-to-market fit usually means that when you go to an investor and you say, these are who our ideal clients are, and we've done pretty well with founder-led sales. Now we're ready to hire our first sales team or significantly expand our sales organization. These are the unit economics we're currently looking to achieve. Go-to-market fit means that you've gotten beyond founder-led sales, that you've hired and retained a significant sales team and expanded that sales team, and likely have multiple team leaders and multiple sales reps working under them. And you've had lots of people that have achieved and exceeded quota for multiple quarters in a row. And you don't have a revolving door problem on your sales team. You've achieved all of that. Then you're said to have achieved go-to-market fit, because then you can go to an investor and say, I need X million, I need 10 million, whatever it is, to expand what we're actually doing. And with a high degree of certainty that as you add more jet fuel to your revenue growth engine, that the wheels aren't going to completely fall off. As long as you have that, then you're in a good position to worry about generating more leads. And if you're looking to generate more leads, it's basically the same best practice that would be applied throughout the full data center ecosystem, is knowing that ideal client profile, having a target account list, within those target account lists, knowing the 2 or 3 most important economic stakeholders, which in a mid-sized to enterprise company will almost certainly be some kind of marketing executive. It could be a chief revenue officer, it could be a chief commercial officer. And a much smaller company, it certainly is going to be the C-levels. It could even be the CEO if it's a small enough kind of company. But yeah, knowing those roles, knowing the stakeholders that are typically sitting on the decision committees in your prioritized client list, when you look at your 10 or 20 biggest clients that you want a lot more of, that's incredibly important for setting the personas, figuring out their goals and challenges, and building a lead generation strategy that appeals to people throughout the full journey. It used to be that most marketing and media companies were primarily focusing on late stage leads. At this stage of the game, it's not relatively new that people do a ton of research before they get to you. And at this stage of the game, for a marketing and media company to have completely missed the 2010s and the early 2020s and not understand that lead generation is a lot about educating and building trust and staying in front of people throughout the full journey and being in a position to shape the criteria. If you're arriving this late to the stage and you're just trying to get that first lead to be an initial meeting with someone from your sales team, then probably go back and review what all of the data center operators and all the technology companies and all the facilities companies have been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. Because rest assured, things like webinars and landing pages and premium content and LinkedIn ads and segmentation, these are things that have been best practices throughout the data center ecosystem for 10 or 15 years now. Now, AI definitely throws a monkey wrench in all of this. It definitely complicates it, because in addition to your salespeople having competition from people doing research on Google, which is becoming less of a factor, it's actually even a bigger problem now, because instead of them clicking on 10 blue links, they can go to ChatGPT and Gemini and Copilot and Perplexity and Claude and get instant answers as if they spent a couple of hours manually doing this research. So your biz dev people from your marketing and media company are not only in competition with search results, they're not only in competition with people asking questions on LinkedIn, they're not only in competition with people watching YouTube videos, you are actually in direct competition for attention with the very generative AI tools that are fueling all of the growth in the data center ecosystem. And that's when you realize that extreme specialization and those marketing and those revenue professionals, those RevOps professionals, chief commercial officers, whoever are your core buyer personas, they need to see your client-facing team members as their peers. That changes who you hire. That changes how you invest in upskilling and reskilling and cross-training. And it certainly changes how you position those folks with their job titles and how they look to the people that you're looking to create awareness with and educate and build trust with. But when it comes to lead generation at this stage of the game, just trying to get people to book a free analysis, to book a talk to sales engagement, to book a free audit, not going to cut it anymore. You're, especially on the marketing side, there is a lot of self-loathing. There is a lot of marketing and salespeople that do not like spending time with other marketing and salespeople that are looking to market and sell to them. Don't underestimate how big of a factor that is. So we need to make sure that we're building resources for the self-driven buyer's journey that allow us to get in early and often, to have surface area and as many of those 28 touch points as possible throughout the buyer journey. When you do this the right way, great things can happen. When you ignore this and you try to pretend like you have a flux capacitor and you're going back in time 10 or 20 years ago, looking for people that still use a fax machine and a BlackBerry, that are still waiting to be influenced by a media placement in a printed trade journal that's showing up in their physical mailbox on glossy paper. It's important to do a reality check on where we actually are and what your prospects and clients want from a company like yours, because lead generation should look a lot more like professional development and a lot more like learning and development, because they need to see you more like teachers and consultants and subject matter experts about anything and everything that's directly related to their needs of what they would come to a marketing and media company for, not just what you want to sell, but what they care about. So we need to know what's going on in their world. We need to be a lot more client and prospect centric. And we need to do a much better job of giving them a reason to want to spend time with you in the first place. It's not about golf tournaments. It's not about cabana parties. It's not about taking them to a sports event. It's not about a bigger booth. It's not about bigger swag. It's about helping them do their job better by introducing them to best practices for how others in a similar job function, in the same geographic region, in a similar company size, in a similar industry, have navigated these exact same challenges. How do we figure out what those goals and challenges are? We ask them. And if we can't get them to tell us directly, we do surveys, we look at our CRM system, we look at how they self-describe themselves on their LinkedIn profile, the kinds of content that they're sharing. We do searches to see what shows up. And we aggregate, we amalgamate that, we synthesize that all together, and we figure out what the biggest goals are, what the biggest challenges are for this particular job role, ideally in descending order of frequency and descending order of popularity. That's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center digital marketing and media company can generate more leads. It's more of the right leads. It's not leads as a vanity metric. We need to get out of selling vanity metrics. That's what's screwing up this entire industry's perception of marketing and sales right now, as they think more is better. More is not necessarily better if it's the wrong people in the wrong context. We need to get the right people in the right context to see you and your team members as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center, digital marketing, and media for their specific kind of job function in their geographic region for a company that's roughly their size in their particular industry. And the better job you can do at that, the more it opens doors, the more tone deaf you are to the reality of the self-driven buyer's journey, the more you're going to be banging your head against the wall. So these are company culture issues, which is a lot of times why this needs to start at the C-level. Why for small companies, it certainly needs to be something that your CEO cares about. And it usually comes down to a frustration that, why are our prospects and clients treating us like crap? Why are they ghosting us? Why are they condescending to us? Why are they cherry picking us? Why are all these things happening? It starts because they don't trust you. They don't respect you. And the reason they don't respect you is you're showing up acting like an obnoxious car salesperson. Do better. Look a lot more like a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, and a thought leader when it comes to what a revenue professional would care about, what a marketing professional would care about, what a sales or a customer success professional would care about, what a board member would care about, what a CFO would care about, what a CEO cares about. Understand who the economic buyer is, understand what's going on in their world, and how you add value. The better job you can do with that, and the better job you do with aligning your lead generation strategy around that, the more they're going to want to spend time with you. And that's the key with all of this, is we need to put ourselves in a position where the most important stakeholders want to spend time with you and your experts. Do that well, great things will happen. Do the opposite, and the opposite happens. That's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center digital marketing and media company can generate more leads. So that puts us at the halfway point for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been enjoying this week's show so far, be sure to hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on wherever you're watching. We're going to take a real quick break, and then we'll dive into 3 more big challenges that we're hearing about throughout the entire data center ecosystem.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. So what's up next? How does an IT infrastructure provider improve its lead generation and sales? How does a company that's principally in the business of providing IT infrastructure improve its lead generation and sales? That's a great question. And I'm so glad that they included the word IT, the acronym IT, in front of infrastructure, because infrastructure is one of those topics in the data center ecosystem that can mean 2 different things depending on its context. For a data center facilities related company, for a general contractor, for a real estate professional, for an investor, infrastructure usually refers to power utilities and telecommunications utilities that have to do with the facilities side of the data center ecosystem. However, for an IT infrastructure provider, that usually has to do with things like telecommunications, cabling, connectivity, fiber, usually things that an IT professional would get involved in as opposed to a facilities engineer. So I'm so glad this particular company clarified that they work more on the technology side of the data center ecosystem with infrastructure as opposed to just infrastructure in general. So what can a information technology IT infrastructure provider do to improve its lead generation and sales? So let's think about, so the IT infrastructure company is part of the data center technology ecosystem. Over at DCSMI, we catalog 22 different kinds of data center technology companies, of which infrastructure is one of those. So it sits side by side. Its first cousins are things like storage, hardware, software, cybersecurity. Those are some of the natural companies that would be fantastic co-marketing partners to potentially work with, because you're basically selling to the same core group of people. In most cases, an IT infrastructure provider is selling to 2 different kinds of data center professionals. You're selling to data center professionals, data center technology professionals who work for a data center operator, or you're selling to IT professionals who work for a company that has its own data centers, like an enterprise that owns 1 or more of its own data center operators. So data centers. So you're either working for a company that owns its own data centers, or you're working for a data center operator. And then within data center operators, it could be a co-location operator, a hyperscale operator, an edge operator. It could be a company that provides modular data centers or wholesale data center facilities. Usually the wholesale data center provider is working more at the facilities level as opposed to the technology level. So you're more than likely, if you're working with operators, probably spending most of your time with colos, hyperscale, and edge kinds of data center providers. So with that in mind, what can you do to improve your lead generation and sales? I think we have to be super clear as to where your company has done best in the past. And a lot of that's a function of your company size. Generally, smaller IT infrastructure providers are going to have more success selling to small to mid-sized companies, and huge IT infrastructure providers are going to have more success selling to mid-market and enterprise. There are exceptions to all of that, but typically an enterprise company will struggle a lot of times to sell to SMBs, to small and medium-sized businesses, because their cost structure and their way of doing things is a lot more aligned with the needs of a mid-market or enterprise company. And conversely, a small IT infrastructure provider, your resources and your value proposition, your competitive positioning, your differentiation is most appealing to a small to mid-size or mid-market kind of company. So with that in mind, a lot of that will dictate the company size factor when you set up your ideal client profile. But that's essentially what we should be doing first when it comes to figuring out your lead gen and sales strategy. Is what does your ideal client profile look like? And if you don't already have one of those built out, you can certainly start by looking at the logos on your website, looking at your testimonials, your reviews, your case studies, looking at your CRM, talking to your sales leaders, your revenue leaders, talking to your finance leaders, your CEO, if it's a small enough company, and try to get a feel for who the most profitable clients are. Who do you want a lot more of to be buying IT infrastructure from your company, IT infrastructure products and IT infrastructure services? And once you have that in mind, if you don't already have an ideal client profile, a simple one pager that documents where these clients are located, how big or small they are in certain industries that are a better fit than others, you definitely need to set about having that simple one page ideal client profile. And then when it comes to IT infrastructure and the geographic part of it, is the good part is a lot of times selling IT infrastructure is very conducive to needing a minimum amount of going on site. There's certain cases where going on site very frequently is a big part of that, but there's certainly a lot of parts of IT infrastructure, like virtualization, for example, is a perfect scenario where you may go on site initially and from time to time, but a heck of a lot of that can certainly be done remotely. So what that means is, by the nature of the engagement that you have with your clients and your products and services, you may be able to have a much wider geographic region that you service compared to a company that's providing infrastructure on the facility side. And a company that's providing infrastructure to facilities professionals, they're going on site a lot by the nature of what it is that you do. On the technology side, you may be able to go on site a lot less frequent, which means that you can have a wider geographic coverage, and sometimes you may be able to supplement that and have a wider geographic expanse because of your channel partner relationships that are in that particular geographic region. So that will help you figure out the geographic part of it. Company size, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, the larger your company is, the more likely it is that you're going to do best and be in your most profitable sweet spot selling to enterprises and mid-market. The smaller your company size is, the more likely it is that you're doing best when you're selling to smaller or mid-sized companies where they've looked at the big guys and said, nah, we want more of a personal touch. We want more of a direct pipeline into the leadership of the company. Heck, it would be awesome if we had the mobile number of the CEO or the CTO or the head of product of the company. And unless they're a huge enterprise client, they're coming nowhere near getting that kind of access if you're a huge company. But a smaller company, there's a lot of things that you can do just selling on the vulnerabilities of the weakness of the big guys. So a lot of how you set that range for the minimum size a client should be, the maximum size a client should be, will be figured out based on your existing resources. You know what your minimum entry point is for your various products and services. That will help you back into how big a company needs to be to afford your minimums. And you likely know after a lot of experience where you're outmatched at a company when it's a certain size just isn't a fit for what you're able to deliver today. So that will give you a region for a lot of IT infrastructure companies. For argument's sake, let's say we're talking about an ICP, an ideal client profile, where the company needs to have at least 50 employees, but no more than 1,000 employees or no more than 5,000 employees or something like that. And then by the nature of what you do with IT infrastructure, that, depending on the geographic region, could put you in a place where having compliance versus not having compliance could be the make or break on a deal. Not quite as much as being the operator, but you're working really closely with the operators. So be careful about getting overly invested in certain geographic regions where you don't have all of the compliance accreditations that you need to be successful in that region, especially for certain kind of industries or verticals. And if you specialize in those verticals, you know exactly what I'm talking about, like financial services, healthcare, government, education, e-commerce. And if you don't specialize in those and you've lost deals early because of those reasons, again, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So that's your ideal client profile that drives setting up your target account lists. From that target account list, you're likely divvying that up to individuals on your team as assigned named accounts that they're going to work. And then essentially what we're looking to do for improving our lead generation and sales is figuring out a way to get in early and often. Why is early and often so incredibly important? Well, we're now in a world where the main buyer's journey that IT buyers go through is a self-driven buyer's journey, meaning that they're going to do just tons of research before they ever get to you. 10 years ago, this was still a thing. It just wasn't as big of a thing as it is today. 10 years ago, it was very common to find that most of your IT buyers would get about halfway through their journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing, and then they'd be ready to talk to someone from your sales team. At the time, CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, did some research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions, and they found that about 56, 57% of a typical buyer's journey was over before vendor contact or prospect contact. That wasn't too bad, because if you did everything right, you were still in there for the final 43, 44% of the journey. You had a significant amount of surface area. That number is now way in the distant rearview mirror. Very much a point of nostalgia. Add 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people getting used to working from home at the beginning of the 2020s. And that 56, 57% number has jumped all the way to 83%. Gartner shows 83% of a typical buyer's journey is now over before vendor contact. They're doing all of the research, all the comparing of options, all the evaluating pricing before they ever get to you. So even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there for the final 17% of their journey. You're excluded from the first 83% of the game. And it's a really, really dangerous place to be, because they're spending time learning from someone. Someone else is setting the criteria that they're using to evaluate your category for IT infrastructure. And if you don't want to get eliminated early on and you want to stack the decks in your company's favor, we need to figure out a way to get you and your colleagues in there early and often. And the most important reframe with all of this is to recognize that while people are more sales allergic than they've ever been, they're more sales adverse than they've ever been, they still need to learn. So to the extent that you can radically make over your competitive positioning so that your account executives, your account managers, your marketers, your sales team looks a lot more like teachers, consultants, trusted advisors, subject matter experts, perhaps even thought leaders, we can earn our way back in early and often to be perceived a lot more like professional development and learning development and a lot less like vendors. We need to get out of the vendor box, and once and for all, we need to stay out of the vendor box. That's how we ensure that we put ourselves in a position where the key people in these accounts keep coming back to us to learn from us. And they keep bringing more and more of their colleagues with them. So we meet other people on the decision committee. And we're proactively driving alignments and helping to establish like criteria that they're using to evaluate our entire category early and often. This nearly guarantees that we get on and stay on the shortlist. And when we do this really, really well, a lot of your competitors will start to fall off the shortlist. And in some cases, we may even discover that when you get to the point that they are in market and ready for a sales conversation, they've reached the decision stage of the journey, you may discover that the shortlist has collapsed to a shortlist of one company, your company. And when that happens, it is truly a beautiful thing when they're coming to that sales meeting and they're quoting your experts. They are literally using the methodology that they learned about from attending your breakfast seminars and your lunch and learns and your webinars as the methodology that they've used among their entire team to evaluate all of the options in your category. And when that happens, again, a truly beautiful thing. So that's what I'd be thinking about for an IT infrastructure provider that wants to improve its lead generation and improve its sales, is put yourself in a position where your lead generation and your sales looks a lot more like education, looks a lot more like part of their professional development and learning and development process. That's what motivates the right people to want to show up to your educational events. That's what motivates those people to bring their coworkers with them, other members of the decision committee, even at some point their boss. That's what motivates those folks to look around your conference room that seats 20 people and realize that there's 4 people from the same company. And they come up to you before or after and they're like, well, you've met 4 of us so far. Why don't you just come in next Friday? We have our all hands meeting and you can talk for 10 or 15 minutes about this and meet the whole IT organization, all 25 of us on the team. You're like, whoa, that would be awesome. Sign me up. And this is what the future of lead generation and sales looks like for being competitively positioned in a self-driven buyer's journey. So regardless of whether you're selling to IT professionals at a data center operator or selling to IT professionals that work for an enterprise that has its own data centers, this is exactly the playbook that I'd be thinking about for how a IT infrastructure provider can improve its lead generation and improve its sales. If you're enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help us please spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on. What do we have up next? What's our next question, our next topic for this week? So now we're going to look at a company that is straddling the lines of data center operator and data center technology provider. So how does a leading colocation and interconnection provider improve its demand generation? How does a company that principally positions itself as being in the colocation data center operator business and interconnection improve its demand generation? So the first question is, how closely integrated are these two services? In other words, are you able to sell colocation and interconnection to most of your clients? Or has this come about as a result of mergers and acquisition recently or a while back, and you still kind of distinctly have a client base that's predominantly interconnection and predominantly colocation and different sales teams that sells to them? I'd like to hope that even if this wasn't built organically and it came about through M&A, that you're now tightly integrated enough that it's one homogenous client that is a buyer of both colocation and interconnection from your company. So when it comes to improving demand generation, the name of the game is arriving early and arriving often. And in order for us to arrive early and often, we need to know who it is that we're trying to reach and what they care most about. And a key part with that is getting really specific about who your target accounts are, who your target client is, who will do best, who is your sweet spot for what you can deliver today. Not what you'd like to be delivering in 5 years and not what you did 5 years ago, but when you look at your 10 most profitable clients right now, based on your current capabilities and your near future roadmap of what's coming down the pike in the coming weeks and in the coming months, no more than 3 to 6 months ahead of where we are right now. What does that look like for what kind of company and what kind of individual is going to get the most value from essentially hiring your company and signing on with your company for both colocation and interconnectivity? So once we have that, we can get really specific on who the key people are in these accounts. And larger companies that you're selling to will generally have more granular job responsibilities, which potentially means you have more buyer personas to keep track of, more segmentation to worry about. And if you're selling to smaller companies, even mid-sized companies, you'll tend to have fewer different roles because people tend to wear more of the same hats. They have a lot more one person is taking on a lot more responsibilities. So we need to be crystal clear on the size part of your ideal client profile, because that dictates basically how granular your segmentation strategy needs to be, how many different kinds of people we need to worry about generating demand from. When it comes to co-location and interconnection, the geographic part of your ideal client profile, that should be pretty straightforward. Where your facilities are located, where you can run connectivity, where you have existing relationships, that's geographically where you can sell to. And there's going to be 20% of your revenue that's going to come from people that are specifically looking for presence in your market that aren't physically located in your market, but most of the times people that are located in your market that are your best prospects for co-location and interconnectivity. So once we have the geographic part and the company size nailed down, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to co-location especially, there's certain kinds of companies that demand certain kinds of accreditations, certifications, compliance type of requirements. So depending on where you're located, should know basically what these are, especially if you're selling to highly regulated industries like healthcare, financial services, education, government. So either you have those accreditations for your particular market or you don't. If you do, that's a core part of your demand generation. If you don't, and you know you're going to get excluded, knocked out, disqualified really, really early, that's also part of your demand generation strategy, because we need to make sure that we're specifically not wasting resources on those kinds of accounts. And that manifests itself when we get more into the lead generation side of demand generation. But at least we should have situational awareness that as we're creating copywriting for our website, as we're thinking through our social media strategy, as we're thinking about email marketing, as we're thinking about digital ads, as we're thinking about events marketing, we want to make sure that we're focusing on targets, that we're focusing on the right kind of prospects, the right kind of segments where we can win, and that we're not wasting a lot of efforts or any efforts ideally at all on places where we know our sales team cannot win. So that's what I'd be thinking about at a high level. Then as we dig a little deeper, once we know exactly who these stakeholders are, we need to figure out how we're adding value to the full journey, not just the end when they're ready to talk to sales. By default, if your company is not currently running a robust thought leadership program, if you don't currently have a robust webinar and educational events program, you likely are focusing mostly on bottom of the funnel, late buyer's journey stage interactions, late buyer's journey stage lead generation, which means by definition, you're probably doing very little demand generation and you're just looking to harvest the existing part of what's already out there. In order for us to have a full journey relationship with these prospects, so we can have surface area, own as many of the 28 touch points as possible between complete stranger and purchase decision, we need to really understand a day in the life of each of these people that we're trying to get to spend time with us. Because if we don't, there's a really good chance that whatever we're talking about is not what they're going to care about right now. It's what you want them to care about, but it's not what they care about right now. And the way we figure out what it is that they care about right now is we need to go to them and figure that out. If they'll have conversations with us face-to-face or on a Zoom, that's great. If not, at the minimum, you can run surveys of your existing prospects and customers. You can look in your CRM for your existing prospects and customers. You certainly can study a stack of LinkedIn profiles and look up what you find out when you put in first name, company name, first name, last name, job title, company name, and see what comes up. Essentially, we need to figure out the handful of the biggest goals that they're working on. These are things that typically will show up like in OKRs, objectives and key results, job descriptions. Many times it'll show up on a LinkedIn profile. What are the 5 or 6 biggest goals that they're working on individually as a team and as a company? And then conversely, we need to figure out what they're struggling with. And again, these are things that many times will show up in conversations, they'll show up in surveys, they'll show up in CRM. You need a fair amount of trust a lot of times to get the inside track on what's really going on, but we need that. And we need the consensus on that. And we ideally need to be able to stack rank. So we know the most commonly heard goals, the most commonly heard challenges. And we use that to fuel our entire go-to market strategy. So we're communicating in a way that's hyper relevant for who they are, where they are, and most of all, what they care about right now. In order for you to get those folks to care about what you want them to care about, we first need to demonstrate to them that we're meeting them where they are. In order for them to be interested in you, you need to be interesting to them right now. And the way we're interesting to them right now is showing up in a way that adds value to what they're trying to figure out professionally by introducing them to best practices for how other people in similar job functions in the same geographic region, in similar size companies, perhaps as specific and even in the specific industry that they operate within. Like, for example, a vice president or IT infrastructure executive in Western Europe in a company with anywhere from a couple dozen to a few hundred employees that is in financial services, that hyper specific. And when you can offer those kinds of insights that help someone like that do their job better at the intersection of everything that's directly or indirectly related to co-location and interconnection, you get them to stop the scroll. You get them to pause. You're essentially pulling them in through the virtual shirt collar digitally and saying, whoa, how did they know? How did they know I was dealing with this? I can't ignore this. This is too important. This is how we battle the crazy amounts of competition there is for their attention, 7x24 by 365, is hyper relevance for who they are and what they care about. That's the big unlock for demand generation. And the better job you do with understanding your ideal client profile, the better job you do with prioritizing your buyer personas and understanding those most important buyer personas and how you and your client-facing team members can add value to those individuals as they learn and grow, as they go through their professional development, their learning and development process. That's the big unlock with all of this demand generation. Let's be realistic. Your prospects and clients don't want to spend a lot of time with your sales team anymore. They don't want to spend a lot of time with your marketers. They just don't. We're in a self-driven buyer's journey. AI has accelerated this even more. They get a lot more immediate gratification from talking to ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Claude and Perplexity than they do from talking with a lot of the members of your sales team. If your sales team is just showing up and reading the website and reading slides to them and playing the explainer video that they can read on their own, they're not adding value. They want to spend time with their peers. To the extent that members of your client-facing team look and provide value that's a lot more aligned with what they get from their peers, you'll get a good foot in the door. If you don't, you won't. This is the new currency for how we capture attention, is we need to be able to provide a significant amount of value to these folks throughout the full journey. They'll spend time with peers. They can even be significantly more junior peers than they are, but they have to believe that you understand who they are, where they are, and what they care about, that you understand enough of their world to provide value to them. The best way to demonstrate this is education and trust building, hosting your own educational events in person, virtually, live, on demand, full length, chunked up into smaller segments, repurposed, all of the above for how you reach them. But it is incredibly important when it comes to demand generation for co-location and interconnection that we understand exactly who the most important stakeholders are, exactly what's going on in their world, and exactly how your client-facing team members can provide value to them throughout the entire journey. So it feels a lot more like learning and development. It feels a lot more like a natural part of their professional development process, and it feels a lot less like engaging with a vendor. This is how to get out of the vendor box. This is how to stay out of the vendor box. This is how to get on the short list. This is how to stay on the short list. And this is exactly where I'd start for how a leading co-location and interconnection provider can improve its demand generation. And that brings us to our final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching on, and we will add that to the consideration queue for topics that we look at, for potential topics that we look at for upcoming shows. So what is our final question? Oh, this is a really good one. This is from a professional services company. And the good part with this professional services company is it's a little bit vague what part of the data center ecosystem they operate within. So that means that we'll have to take it as they're working across multiple parts of the data center ecosystem. So the question is, how does a data center services and solutions company get in front of the opportunity first? How does a data center services and solutions company get in front of the opportunity first? First mover advantage. This is a fantastic question. So you're in the professional services business. You provide services and solutions in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And because you didn't mention specifically the part of the ecosystem that you work within, it's a pretty reasonable guess that you're working across technology and facilities. So that means There's 22 different kinds of data center technologies that you could conceivably be supporting. There's 13 different kinds of facilities related products or services that you could be working within. So a couple dozen different potential areas of discipline that you have to integrate across. For starters, that definitely presents some logistical challenges when it comes to growing your talent, when it comes to growing your team, and the kinds of CVs, the kind of LinkedIn profiles, the kinds of backgrounds that you're looking for among your professional services roster. But your question really wasn't on recruiting. That's a whole separate episode. We've talked quite a bit about recruiters in the past. We've had recruiters on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. But you're looking in this particular case to get in front of opportunities first. So we need to get a lot more specific about where these opportunities are. And in order for us to get clarity about the opportunities we're looking for, we need to make sure that your company is at least at a certain life cycle, at a certain maturity level, where we can see patterns. So in other words, at the absolute minimum, we need to make sure that your company has product market fit, that you know exactly the products and services that your ideal clients purchase from you, the price points that they pay, how often they buy or the duration of their agreements, and basically all the core unit economics that help you satisfy strong demand. Usually companies achieve product market fit at relatively early stages, even at relatively small sizes with as few as a handful or a couple handfuls of employees. Usually the next growth stage up from there is go-to-market fit, meaning that you've evolved beyond founder-led sales, that someone who isn't a partner, an equity partner in the company, can actually lead a sales team and successfully hire account executives and sales development reps. And over a period of ramp time and over a period of sales cycle length, you've had multiple people from your team that love their jobs, that have exceeded quota, that have made it to President's Club, and you don't have a revolving door of sales professionals in and out. You have a core amount of retention, and you've figured out basically how to build a sales playbook so that when you go to investors and you say, I want to raise 7 figures, 8 figures, perhaps even 9 figures, and this business is probably more like 7 figures. If you're looking for a capital raise, that you have a fair amount of confidence that as you add more capital, that you'll have a consistent result as you grow your sales and services teams. So that's go-to-market fit. You may also have achieved channel partner market fit if you work with channel partners like integrators, managed service providers, master agents, value-added resellers. More than likely, what we're most concerned about is that you've at least achieved product market fit and go-to-market fit. Once you've achieved that, we should be able to have an ideal client profile, so we have a lot of clarity on where these companies are located. Because you're working across not just technology and facilities, the geographic part of your ideal client profile is a pretty big deal. If you were just working on the technology side of the data center ecosystem, it's actually reasonably likely that you won't have to go on site as often. But if you're working on the facility side of the data center ecosystem, you're going to tend to go on site a lot more often. If you work with general contractors, if you work with real estate professionals, even outside of the facilities part of the data center ecosystem, you're definitely going on site a lot more than IT professionals. So with that in mind, that helps us figure out geographically how narrow or how broad we can be in our addressable market and our ideal client profile. Let's also get realistic about size. So for a services and solutions company that's operating as like a hybrid between a professional services firm, and usually solutions implies that you're reselling some products that are manufactured by another company. So you have professional services capabilities, and there's even parts of your company that overlap into outsourced sales and marketing, because it may not be a huge part of your profitability or your revenue, but if you're earning revenue on the difference between buying products, by buying other people's products and the price that you sell those at, if you're earning margin, then you're at least part of your company is coming from providing some kind of outsourced sales and marketing function to that particular manufacturer that you're a channel partner for. So with that in mind, you're operating primarily as a professional services company, maybe equally split or some kind of split between technology and facilities, and a little bit on the outsourced sales and marketing company to the extent that you're representing or reselling some products that are manufactured by another company that's not yours. So to getting in front of the opportunity first, we're again talking about the ideal client profile, where they're located. How big or small they are is a really, really big deal. And your size and their size a lot of times is a big dictator, a big predictor of what makes the most sense for where to put the flags on the ground, where to put the guardrails up, for how big they need to be to afford your minimum engagement levels, and at what point, if they get so large, they've kind of outgrown your company. When it comes to the services side, professional services, which for this kind of company is usually where most of the margin is coming from, you'll know what your minimum engagement level is, what your minimum program looks like. And with that in mind, over time, you'll try to figure out how big a company needs to be realistically to afford your minimum program in terms of their number of employees, in terms of their amount of revenue. For a professional services company in this space, you're likely at the extremes in the data center ecosystem. Usually really tiny companies are forced to do a lot in-house just because they don't have the resources to outsource everything. And the huge enterprises are doing a lot of stuff in-house many times with services because nobody does it better. So like, what's the sweet spot of big enough to afford you, but not so large that they've outgrown you? For this company, when I talk to founders, when I talk to CEOs, maybe it's something like a minimum of 50 employees, a minimum of 5 or 10 million in revenue or your local currency equivalent, and the maximum size of maybe up to 5,000 employees or 1,000 employees or something like that. It's possible you have the capabilities to sell the huge Fortune 1000, Fortune 500, Fortune 50 kinds of companies. But most often for a services and solutions company, your sweet spot is going to be somewhere in that Goldilocks range, not too hot, not too cold, not too big, not too small, maybe like 50 employees or 200 employees on the low end, up to 1,000 or 5,000 employees on the upper end of the range. Again, because on the services side, if they're too small to afford your services, they're going to try to get by with DIY as much as possible, even if it's not the best option. And on the huge enterprises, a lot of times they want to do these things internally because they have incredibly specific requirements that they can't find anyone big enough to actually be able to provide, to be able to live up to. On the solution side, if you're reselling products, it's a little different, but there's similar guardrails to think about as well. For huge enterprise clients, when it comes to purchasing products from a manufacturer, a lot of times they're trying to cut you out. This is classic channel conflict that's been going on for decades. I actually got my start in the IT industry back in the 1990s and 2000s, working in the VAR managed service this space. And this is an age-old challenge that publications like CRN, Computer Reseller News, have been literally writing about for decades. So count on the fact that there will always be huge companies that want to cut out the intermediary and buy direct from the manufacturer. So that's an issue at the upper end of the range. On the lower end of the range, it's, your sales talent is not cheap. Hiring highly technical account executives and sales development reps that understand your ideal clients, that understand your business model, you have overhead. So you know what your minimums are. You know how big they need to be to afford the kinds of solutions and services that you sell to. So again, adjust accordingly. On the services side, there may also be some implications, especially with industry. The reason being is the more deeply you get involved with the IT side of the house, especially working with data center operators or even enterprises that have their own data centers, there's certain like compliance and accreditation and certifications that they're going to want you and your company to have to be prerequisites for getting a foot in the door to provide those infrastructure kind of services. If you have those, great. List that kind of experience in your capabilities on your website. Certainly list it in your ideal client profile if you don't know about it early on, so you're not wasting a lot of time trying to come up with opportunity generation that's going to be nearly impossible for you to close based on that limitation, based on that particular roadblock. So the name of the game with all of this is extreme clarity on that ideal client profile. And from that ideal client profile, building your target account list. You can divvy up those named accounts among different people on your sales team. But at the end of the day, prospecting is so different today, especially for this kind of firm, than it was 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, the IT buyers, the facilities execs, the data center managers who would engage a data center services and solutions company, they would do a lot of research. They were on Google all the time. They were watching YouTube videos. They were looking at review websites. They were attending webinars. But you could still count on the fact that they would get about halfway through that journey and they'd be ready to talk to someone from your team. Introduce generative AI, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, Gemini, Copilot, the mother of immediate gratification. And that's what your sales team is basically competing against. So in order for you to provide more value than your ideal prospects can get from the immediate gratification of engaging with these Gen AI tools, we really, really need to up the ante. And in most cases, what this revolves around is getting out of the vendor box, which means never, never, never leading with the solutions, and instead leading with the value, the goals, and the challenges that you address with clients. If you're leading with the products that you're selling, you probably know this, but you were sunk 10 years ago. Now you're really, really marginalized, really, really commoditized. For companies that are doing this well, they're owning the full journey. They're getting in early and they're getting in often. They're saturating the surface area of those full 28 touch points. So their prospects and clients are highly motivated to want to spend lots of time with your client-facing subject matter experts. And in order to do that, in order to get in front of those opportunities first, we need to know how we can provide exceptional value to our prioritized buyer personas early and often. We need to know what's on their top 5 list for their biggest goals, ideally stack ranked in priority order. And we need to know what's on the top 5 list, top 5 or 6 biggest challenges that they're struggling with right now. And that's what we need to lead with. That's the education, that's the learning and development, the professional development experience, events experience that we need to provide to that very, very specific list of that persona in that particular company. And when we do this well, it's perceived as incredibly relevant, hyper-specific, so hyper-specific that it's nearly impossible to ignore. And when it's impossible to ignore, it's far more likely that when you say, hey, it's great to see that you registered for our upcoming webinar on topic or upcoming breakfast seminar or lunch and learn, but we know when it comes to finding the right services and solutions for the CTO of a mid-sized manufacturing company in Northern England or the Midwestern United States or Singapore, wherever it is, we know it typically takes a team. There's typically people involved from operations, from support, from cybersecurity, from finance and compliance. So with that in mind, who else would benefit from attending? And when you do this well, you start to notice that you get multiple people from the same company registering for your in-person events, registering for your webinars. So you're able to proactively drive alignment in the early and the middle stages of the journey. So you get to set the criteria that they use to evaluate your category. This is what it means to get in front of the opportunity first. But we can't just be first and ignore the middle and the bottom of the funnel as well, because that leaves you incredibly vulnerable. So when we figure out what those 10 or 12 topics are, the 5 or 6 big goals and the 5 or 6 big challenges, those are our 10 or 12 opportunities, our 10 or 12 potential entrees once a month for the next 10 or 12 months. A monthly breakfast seminar series or lunch and learn series, a monthly webinar series. We need to keep getting in front of them over and over and over again. And we'll know this is working well because the first time around we had clusters of 2, 3, 4 people from the same company. And those clusters keep getting bigger and we're getting more and more surface area in those companies. We're meeting more and more of the decision committee proactively, one more in a position to dramatically shape the criteria that they use to evaluate your entire category. This is what gets leads generated. This is what it means to do lead nurturing well. This is what it means to educate and build trust. This is what it means to turn the corner and change out your company's culture so that your account executives, your account managers, your sales development reps, your marketers are now seen more as teachers and consultants, subject matter experts, and trusted advisors. The reason they're going to Copilot and ChatGPT and Perplexity and Claude and Gemini is because they trust those tools. They need to trust you more. There's a lot of ways to do that, but at the end of the day, they need to trust you more than the tools. They need to get more value from you and your client-facing team members than they're getting from those generative AI tools. If they can't, you're going to be immediately treading water. So the smartest people in your company on each and every one of those topics need to participate in your educational events. It's not a huge bar. If you have a half a dozen subject matter experts in your company and you need to cover 12 sessions a year, Every 6 months, it's their turn to come up with a 30 or 45-minute educational talk that explains how other companies in this particular, how other individuals in this kind of company of roughly this size in this kind of industry are navigating this big goal or this challenge they're trying to achieve. What this means is if you're the internal champion of this program, you need buy-in from your CEO to motivate your internal subject matter experts to take this seriously. At the minimum, 8 weeks out, you should be sitting down and planning the outline for the content. You should be interviewing them, taking the notes from that interview and helping to build the slides. 4 weeks out, you should be doing a rehearsal. You want this content to be so fantastic that if they were in front of an audience at a national conference or a global conference, that you're highly confident that the mobile app reviews would score this session as one of the top sessions of the entire conference, that they get a nearly perfect score on their report card from the people in the audience, that following the session, there's a long line of people waiting to talk with you and your subject matter expert to talk about what you can do to engage with your company next. This is the aura, this is the feeling, this is the vibe that people need to get when they come to your breakfast seminar, when they come to your luncheon, or when they come to your webinars. And when you do this well, it's very natural that they want to engage, they want to participate, they ask great questions. If you're doing this in person, there's probably a demo or a tour element involved with some of this, but it's largely about providing so much professional development, so much learning and development value to these very specific kinds of buyer personas that they want to spend a lot of learning and development, professional development time with your client-facing experts to get the know, like, and trust going off the charts. One quick caveat with all of this is if you've exhausted your internal subject matter experts, there's no reason why you can't bring in guest experts. If you have contractors or consultants that work with your company, if you have companies that you're a channel partner for and they can provide subject matter experts, that's great. Then you're the moderator, you're the host, you're the concierge, you're introducing these resources. But at the end of the day, we need to provide a ton of value to the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so that they see you and your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything having to do with data center services and solutions. That's how a data center services and solutions company can get in front of the opportunity first, early, and often. And that is the final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments section on whatever platform you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. If you want to get notified about upcoming educational events and resources like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on each and every Sunday. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, make sure to include in the message along with the invitation that you've watched and that you're a fan of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. Just like you, I get a lot of invites, and I want to make sure to prioritize those that are big fans of what we're doing here over at DCSMI. We're so glad that you're able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and we wish you, your team, and your company all the best in growing your impact and your presence throughout the global, national, local, regional, whatever is your ICP's presence within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.